Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the January 22nd work session of the Ann Arbor City Council. We are here today to listen to and discuss protecting and serving public safety. Turn the podium over to the indomitable Mr. Lazarus.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, members of council. We're going to begin today with the first of a series of visioning sessions aimed at capturing council's thoughts on the many issues that affect the future of our city. Each one of these sessions will be a little bit different. Public safety is first in the barrel, primarily because we have to put some things around in the schedule, and as with everything they do, they prove to be adaptable and agile in their approach. So when we look at visioning as part of the budget process, this is the second year of the budget cycle, as we talked about in December, and our intent for this year is to focus only on economic updates to the plan, changes to the plan, and horizon issues, but essentially honor the two-year cycle we entered into in the current year. That gives us the opportunity to look at long-range opportunities, but this does not preclude council from doing deep dives into the FY19 budget as they think appropriate and deem fit. Using the sessions this year for visioning lets us focus on developing financial, technical, and structural approaches so that we become the agile organization that we need to be so we can sustain quality of life for the community. This summer, we will once again engage in the resident satisfaction survey, and that will also be a significant input into the FY20 budget process. And as I said, the end goal is to become an agile and accountable organization that focuses on our community's goals and values. The schedule, as it's shown there, essentially is one of these sessions per month. We're starting with public safety. Next month, we hope to have GCSI in, as well as some of our elected officials, state and county level. So we're going to have a good discussion about legislative updates and then really look at policy agenda development. In March, we're going to look at the budget and cost of service studies, which will have an impact primarily on our utility structure. We go further down the road in April, we want to talk about our infrastructure priorities and projects. As most municipalities face this issue, we have more wants than we have the ability to deliver. So we need to look at prioritization, both on those things that ensure long-term delivery of services, but also those things that improve our quality of life. We then want to look at how we build an inclusive society, focusing on equity and housing. By that time, the One Community initiative with the county will be up and running, but we also want to bring Jennifer in and talk about how that relates to fairness in housing and meeting the affordable housing goals that council has adopted. We move on then to providing a healthy Ann Arbor, looking at parks and recreation, health, and sustainability. And then council takes its summer break. We don't schedule meetings during the summer months or work sessions during the summer months. And when we come back in September, it'll be about the one-year anniversary of when we had the Economic Development Forum in 2017. And we want to look at what it means to be a better business partner, looking at some economic development opportunities and those things that affect our competitiveness as a place to live, work, and play. And then finally, we get back into the budget. After we have our annual meeting with the DDA, we really have to roll up our sleeves because next year will be the start of the two-year budget cycle, and we're starting off there having to make up some ground. When we look at engaging the community, as part of each of these sessions, we want the staff to work with the communications office to gather information, and we can use all the methods that are available to us: surveys, social media input, meetings, and other methods. We're a little short on the lead-up time to do that this evening, but we can certainly, through your input, follow up on your thoughts and your ideas. Each of you has a hard copy form in front of you to fill in, and what you can do is you can use that to take notes. Ms. Higgins has put a form online that you can populate as well, and it may be an opportunity for you to take your thoughts down this evening and then communicate those tomorrow. But we do want to continue the process of gaining input and engaging with our community. We really want the council members to shape the discussions as well by identifying the areas that you would want to provide input and working with us in advance of the sessions so we can form the questions, get feedback, and then have some meaningful exchanges during the work sessions. With that, we're going to move into the protecting and serving part, which is visioning public safety. It's important to start that discussion with a look at our general fund and the growth. What the chart shows you is that we have a structural imbalance in our budget. Our rate of growth for revenues goes up at about 1.6%. Our expenses go up at 2.6%. What's important there is 65% of those expenses are personnel related, so it's very hard for us to adjust those. A lot of them are governed by union contracts. But right now, next year's gap is about 1.18 million. But if we don't make any changes, if you project out to fiscal year 35, all of a sudden that 1% a year looks like a $25 million shortfall per year. Clearly, we're not going to get there because we have the requirement to balance the budget every year. But there is the need to start taking turns now that will keep us from going over the cliff in the future. When we look at the cost of public safety, you can see that it makes up a pretty substantial portion of our general fund. And while you may think 50% of our general fund going to public safety puts us in better stead than some of our peer cities, remember that we do not provide the full suite. We don't provide EMS services, as an example, at least not. Those are provided through Huron Valley. Our firefighters do provide some EMS support, but 50% of the general fund, which is primarily in salaries, does create at times a difficult nut to crack. Our staffing, as you can see, is about 62% of the general fund. The thing that's misleading there is a good part of the general fund expenditures are basically pass-throughs. They're things that we have to pay regardless of our staffing level. So police and fire do make up a substantial portion, both in terms of FTEs and cost. So as we do that, and you consider that, I'm going to turn this over to our assistant chiefs in the fire department who are going to lead you through the discussion. This is a great opportunity for them to introduce and reintroduce themselves to you, as we have two new assistant chiefs and one assistant chief who has served our community for quite a bit longer. So I'm going to turn it over to them. And
good evening. First of all, thanks for having us. Mr. Lazarus, City Administrator Lazarus, thank you for giving us this time for this face-to-face time with City Council. I'm Assistant Fire Chief Ellen Taylor, if you don't know me. I think I know most of you. I'd like to introduce, if you don't know them, the new Assistant Fire Chiefs, and this is Mark Tyler, and this is Mike Kennedy. It's a pleasure to have them on my behalf, to have two fresh new outlooks come into the department. And it's nice to just bang ideas off them in the sense of where we want to go in the future. Okay, so with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and start. Mr. Lazarus has given us this chance to talk to you, and we carefully this afternoon went through the slides because we weren't familiar with what was set up already. So we're going to just pass the baton back and forth, if you don't mind, and we apologize if it kind of goes askew and back and forth. But I'd like to start it off by just going over the core services that the fire department has, or their workforce, and those are the fire suppression, which obviously is the main concern that we have in terms of our community, in terms of fire loss. Hazmat response, we're very active. We're the biggest fire department that is active at the county level. There is a county hazmat team. We have 10 members on that team, the most of any other fire department. Fire prevention, to me, that's very critical and close to heart. The fire prevention deals with complaints. I think a lot of you have had complaints come through you that we've had to step in and handle for the circumstances. It's site plan reviews, it's public education, it's community outreach, it's fire inspections, it's hydrant flow testing for new construction. So there's a lot of events and tasks that are in this Fire Prevention Bureau that a lot of people don't know goes on behind the scenes. Our fourth one up, there's a technical rescue team, and that also is a county team. We currently have 17 members out of, I think, 35 in the county. Very active again. We have a lot of equipment. I think we have a storage unit at the airport that we keep most of the county equipment for emergency response. I'm going to skip over to the EMS responder, and you'll see in the next slide that the majority of our calls are EMS. The sixth component is the emergency management, which was transferred from police department about a year and a half ago. So we're trying to embrace that and look to the future to increase and be more prepared in terms of the whole community. Some of the things that are taking place are evacuation planning and routing, some stadium evacuation and routing as well. We're working very closely with the art fair directors and big events that are taking place in the city, and we're trying to get a grasp of that and work on it. The second slide is a slide that kind of depicts what we actually respond to. As you see, the response is 58% goes to the EMS. I did a little stat searching this afternoon, and the whole calendar year of 2017, we responded to 49 EMS calls. 58% is lower than what we typically have responded to. 5 to 10 years ago, that was 75 to 78%. With that being said, the fires actually have dropped over the years. A couple stats to give you is in 2012, we had 144 structure fires. In 2017, we had 95 structure fires, which is a good amount of a decrease in structure fires. And we'll get into it a little bit more when it comes to the fire prevention. But we also went down in vehicle fires. We went from 35 to 25 vehicle fires. So there's a lot of statistics that show there's just a great improvement over the last few years for the fire department. The fire explosion hazard conditions, 23% of our calls. The service calls is 5%, and all others, which consist of the good intent, the severe weather, and other incident types, are 14%. The next slide is actually dealing with the operations in terms of the response time. And since Assistant Chief Mark Tyler is in charge of the operations, I'm going to hand this slide over to him.
Excuse me as I get my glasses. Okay, happy to be here. Thank you for allowing me to be here today. As Ellen stated, the next slide has to do with turnout times, response times, and according to the EMS and Fire National Response Times, it shows that Ann Arbor is not meeting the national standard for response. And as I look at these times, I can see that they're just a little bit skewed, and they're skewed for what I would consider for the following reasons. Bear with me as I find, okay. Just like any other, when you deal with a CAD system, there can be data issues that make turnout numbers unreliable at a certain point. Technology issues pertaining with HVA and the Washtenaw County 911 switch, that can be an issue considering the fact that when calls come into the Wayne County, they actually go to HVA as well after that. So there's like just a slight delay in that aspect of it. And not only that, but because of manual dispatching, so when the dispatchers do get the call, there's a slight delay because they have to input the information manually. Not only that, but there are other issues in regarding that. Crews can actually be out on the road already and responding from another call. So that also contributes to a slight delay. And then when we're busy, which at times we are, calls can be stacked. So when calls are stacked, that also causes a slight delay. As we're working through this and we're talking with HVA and getting things together, they're in the process of putting together a new CAD system, which will be up and operational in October. So with that occurring, we're hoping that some of this stuff will slowly disappear, meaning that when they get the call in, that it'll be automatically sent out. so crews will not have to wait for the calls to come in. Other reasons that that there might be some delay is that, yes, I'm sorry. So at that point, that's where we are. Now, these calls right here, this list of these times, that's on a 90% percentile. And one of the things that Ann Arbor has the ability to do is Ann Arbor has the ability to adopt a local standard that would allow Ann Arbor to fall within the ranges that we actually would like to see within our community here. So it's not that we're looking to decrease the expectation, it's just we want to be able to work within the expectation. And if we have the ability to set that, then that's what we would be able to do. So with that being said, that's what I have on that, and I'll bring Ellen Taylor back up here. Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, good evening, Mayor and Council. To cover emergency management, so Rick Norman works for the city with emergency management. As Assistant Chief Taylor had mentioned, that was transferred over to the fire department about 18 months ago. In my new role, I'm assisting Rick with the emergency management function, which is why I'm speaking to it tonight. As you know, this past fall was rather busy for you with council with the adoption of City Code Chapter 15 that kind of streamlined and refined the emergency management code for the city. There has been a rewrite of the emergency action guidelines for the city, and those are currently in administrative review and approval. And then you also completed a tabletop back in the fall. Another key benchmark that's not listed on here was the hazard mitigation grant, which is statutory required, but was a fantastic document to kind of set some ways forward for the city, and also allowed us grant opportunities through the hazard mitigation program, which is ran through the Michigan State Police, which is a fiduciary, carries that from a fiduciary standpoint from FEMA. So if we have a federally declared disaster, the fact that our city has that hazard mitigation grant allows us the ability to apply for those funds. So, and it also allows us to prioritize different hazard mitigation. The most common which the city's been has dealt with to this point is the flood mitigation and trying to acquire properties. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Chief Taylor.
Okay, the next slide is on fire prevention, and this is the Fire Prevention Bureau. And there were only 2 goals set up, and one of them was to increase the number of inspections by 5% through the implementation of new technology and the redistribution of assigned inspection districts. Unfortunately, we didn't meet this goal. There's some circumstances where we didn't. The reason why we didn't meet that, the main one I feel is that we applied for a grant, and you all saw a resolution trying to get the tablets paid for and the equipment paid for through a grant, but we did not receive that grant. So thank you, all of you, for approving the December 18th resolution to actually let us go ahead and buy those mobile tablets. That's going to help us greatly in response to being more effective, efficient, and providing better customer service along the line with the inspections. A couple other circumstances that came up, unfortunately, was that we lost the fire marshal. Our experienced, educated fire marshal retired, and that was a hard position to fill, which kind of did a cascade, a domino effect in the sense of we lost some inspectors as well. So instead of having 6 inspectors, we were down to 3 and 4 inspectors in the first 2 quarters of this fiscal period. So that affected our number of inspections with a few other issues that came up. Another one that I need to mention is that the uncertainty in the sense of where we were going to put the fire inspections. We were talking about possibly going over the building department and et cetera. So there was some uncertainty there, so we had to put a halt, and we had to start training those fire inspectors to possibly go back to the fire suppression, which means we needed to train them again on medical protocol, fire equipment, you know, the new techniques and things like that, so that they were up to speed. So that affected it as well. But I really want to concentrate on the positive things that the fire prevention has shown over the last few years. One of them is depicted on this slide, and that is that the fire loss has gone from 5.5 million in 2013 to 581,000 in fire loss. That's tremendous. I want to say that the fire inspection program is a big part of that, to prevent the fire that are occurring. The city of Ann Arbor is very unique in the sense of most of our fires are in commercial buildings. They're not in residential. Nationwide, it's typically more residential fires versus commercial fires, but that is not the case in the city of Ann Arbor. So the program that we implemented and we started really thoroughly in 2012, I think has made a big input or an effect on the fire loss that you see there. Another thing I want to point out is that we've been working very hard in creating a relationship with all the business owners, the major business owners, in response to the fire service fee schedule. We have invited up to, I think it was 25 business owners to work sessions, group work sessions, to discuss and get their input, and review, evaluate, and update that fee schedule. It's gone tremendously with the input that we've received from those business owners. And I want to say that it was very diverse. We made sure that we had the small, the medium, the large, the management, the owners, the tenants. We tried to include everyone in there, especially the hotel owners, because out of the 3,800, 4,000 inspections that we've done in the last few years, the hotels came back and said, hey, well, our fee schedule really went up because we went by the square footage versus the bracketing type fee schedule. So we worked very hard. I'm very pleased that we'll be showing you a fee schedule change shortly here in the near future. One of the things we've done is we've given those big square footage business owners a break in their fee. The second major thing that we're doing is we're implementing a self-inspection pilot program for the hotel and storage unit occupancy classes. And we're excited to start, trying to work even more with these business owners and keep that relationship working in terms of the community relationships. A few other things is that I had mentioned the mobile tablets. We are also exploring and pursuing an alternative service model in hopes to lower the cost. And this kind of interacts with the diversity we're trying to implement, and we have a transitional document that we're working on in the sense of changing the fire prevention a little bit to be more specific on a job task. I would like to see our fire inspectors concentrate totally on fire inspections instead of being distracted on pub ed, community outreach, hydrant testing, all those little permit complaints and things like that. We'd like to restructure it a little bit, and one of the hindrance that we may have is that it needs to be negotiated, and I think one of the slides we talk about, 207, which kind of affects that in terms of negotiation and staying in compliance with the statutory law. I think I've hit most of that. Oh no, one major thing I wanted to bring up is that the fire inspection cost recovery. Although we're down in the last 2 quarters, I wanted to make sure that you were aware that between 2015 and 2017, the cost revenue in fire safety inspections increased by 50%. So we went from 9,000 in cost recovery to 466,000 in 2017. So we did improve, we did increase our efficiency, but obviously there's more room to improve that, and that's our goal in the future here. The last thing I want to talk about is the technology, because now that we have tablets, the mobility technology coming our way, we have ran into a circumstance that the fire department's RMS system, which is a record management system, is Firehouse. Unfortunately, Firehouse is an antiquated database system, and every fire department needs a report management system. They were just purchased by ESO, which is another company. Firehouse had promised that they were going to upgrade their software to be compliant with the state of Michigan's NEMSIS, which is the medical requirements in terms of reporting to the state. Unfortunately, before they were sold, they never upgraded that compliancy. So now we are stuck, along with many, almost all the fire departments in the state of Michigan, that are running into circumstances that we have to transfer or update or replace that RMS system for us. The good thing about this is that we have been working with IT, and we have evaluated over 20 different software packages over the last year and a half. Demos, site visits. We've done a very thorough job, and we are now talking with Detroit and Grand Rapids and trying to work together and possibly going in an RFP together or using GSA pricing so that we could replace our fire system. So I just wanted to bring that up so that you knew that our technology needs to be improved in the RMS system. We don't really have a choice on that in terms of being compliant with the state. So that's going to be coming down the loop here in the near future. The next slide, I'm going to kind of skip so that we don't pass the baton too much tonight. I want to talk about the increased diversity in recruiting. We've done quite a bit of work with the number of personnel working on this. A research paper was completed, a very thorough one, 116-page research paper, researching nationally the best recommendations in terms of trying to attract diversity within the department. There's some recommendations that came out of that. We've also created an employee committee that we've been meeting. We have a strategical matrix plan in place. We're working on that. We've been working very diligently with the community, the communications division there, and we've created brochures, handouts. We're preparing to really make a real strong force to go out and try to recruit in terms of colleges, schools, and et cetera. We've also hired a photographer and took some pictures so that we have some nice photos to show diversity within our department. So it's been lacking in the fire department over the years, and we're now starting to kind of pump that up a little bit so that we're more in line with PD and et cetera. We also have been more active in the regional fire academies. The little bit of diversity that is out there in the fire academies, we're being more active. We're showing up at these academies and trying to make those relationships with those diverse candidates. And lastly, the committee is also looking at changing possibly or looking at different methods of trying to attract diversity in the sense of the requirements that the requirements for a hiring for an applicant and a few other things that, again, came through the recommendations of that study. The ALS component, the paramedic first responder training, what I can say in that is that work is in progress as well. There's a committee that's working. They actually just met again last Friday, and they are digesting all the EMS calls in regards to plotting them on a map, where their location is, and they are trying to come up with the best methods in regards to how we set up our response. And that meaning, do we put the ALS on the engines? Do we put the ALS on the aerials? Do we create a smaller rescue vehicles in certain areas where, the EMS is very dense? So they are definitely working on that, and hopefully we hear a little bit more from them. One of the major hurdles with the ALS is that the best method that we feel as a department within our city and our community, it's going to it has to be approved by the county medical board. So that is one hindrance that we have to work very closely with them to make sure whatever approach that we want to take in that a facet, that we work very closely with the medical control board so that they are on board with us. With that being said, I'm going to hand it to Mike so you can talk about the first two.
All right, Fire Station Master Plan, Chief Collins was the main driver on this, along with one of our firefighters who is doing this as a research project. It's about 50% complete. The hope is that that'll be able to come back before this body at some point in the near future. The very much related part of that is with the accreditation process. With the turnover within the assistant chief ranks, the accreditation process has fallen behind. Last week, meeting with some regional departments throughout Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana, it was hosted by the city of Canton. Canton was hoping to get through it in 2 years. It took them 5. Grand Rapids did it a couple years back. They were also hoping to get through it in 2 years. It took them 10. Certainly don't think it's going to take 10 years for us to do that, but we are working on a adjusted schedule for the accreditation process. The true value of accreditation is the complete review of fire department operations and comparing that against national standards, along with the adoption of what's called a standards of cover and community risk assessment that has to be adopted by this board. And the reason for that is, as Chief Tyler had mentioned, with our response timelines, there's national standards out there, but as we all know, public safety, fire protection is a funded and the responsibility of local government. So it is our city's responsibility to determine the level of protection we want, and then pretty much work backwards from there of how are we going to sustain that. Another large component of accreditation is being able to be more flexible with our response. The response to a single-family 1,000-square-foot home is much different than the response to a fire event, even sprinkler-controlled, on the 6th floor of the hospital or in one of the high-rise that's going in the core downtown area. So that is a big part that the accreditation team wants to see, that we're able to pivot as a community and as an organization to how are we addressing those low hazards, the single-family house fire versus the high hazard, and providing the appropriate response for that. But that's a key part of the community engagement and the local community and the local elected officials deciding what we want that threshold to be. So as we get further down in the accreditation process, we will be back before the board or before the council at several times to receive your input, and then ultimately to go forward in that process, you having to approve that standards of cover and that community risk assessment. With that, just a quick review of fire station locations. So right now we have 5 active stations. The previous station 2 on Stadium is used for fire prevention. One of the issues with the standards of cover is how quickly we can get to our service area, and we try to have that as standard as possible. That's another part of the response times that Chief Tyler was talking about, is making sure that on the north end, where obviously we have a lot of new development going on, to the east, west, south, all throughout the city, that we're trying to get as uniform response as possible. And then that's also measured against, as I previously mentioned, those high hazard areas. So what parts of the community do we have the biggest population densities? Obviously now we're getting much more of the vertical density, where we get into the unique hazards that we deal with the university. So that's a big part of that station location. And then trying to determine where long-term do we want to potentially relocate stations. Stations 3 and 4 are both approaching the 60-year mark, which for those buildings is probably an end of life for them. So do we relocate them at their current location? Do we look at adjusting them? That is all part of that accreditation, and that is also all part of how we kind of move forward to be the most effective fire service we can for our city. A lot of that is then looking at the station location versus population density. There's obviously a high correlation between population density and calls for service. This next slide is just simply showing fire calls. It does, my understanding, show not only structural fire incidents, but vehicle fire, so basically any fire incident. I'm unsure the data set that was used for that. I imagine it's probably just 1 or 2 years based on just 1 year. I'm getting the nod from the dots. So, but part of what that does show is we do have a little bit of the cluster in the city core downtown, but the current distribution of stations is somewhat on par with where it should be, given the distribution of fire incidents. We can't necessarily abandon any part of the city and say, well, that's just farmland or parkland and we don't have many fire incidents. That distribution is pretty much citywide. We then look at the fire station locations versus medical calls. A little bit better heat map there with colors. And we see again that core downtown area. And for the medical calls, as Chief Tyler had previously mentioned, when we run up with the stacking of incidents, especially when we're running one company downtown out of Station 1, and they're responding to the city core center, and then that second due unit is coming from one of the outstations, that then is increasing that response time. So all those factors go into establishing those response times, and then it gets into, as Chief Taylor had mentioned, how do we flex our fleet to be able to be more nimble in terms of using high response units, an HRU, a high response unit that's maybe not on for 24 hours a day. We identify when our peak times are, or it could even be seasonal, as we all know with the student population. So they're just station locations may or may not be the main driver. We may be able to be more flexible in some of our deployment modes to make that happen. So, and the visioning part, the top one with the mapping to core services, that is something that we've been working very diligently with our IT on. They've been a wonderful partner throughout all of this, and that is a really key component to that accreditation effort. We did have some turnover within IT with some retirements, my understanding within the last year, and that has been a bit of a detriment to us with some of that continuity of knowledge of what was done previously. So we are having to rebuild some of that knowledge base to correlate with what we're trying to do for the accreditation efforts. But we do know we need to work on making those data-driven decisions and kind of take the passion out of it and just look at objectively, what are our response times, what is adding or removing a company going to do, what is moving a station a mile up or down the road going to do. So when we get to that point of what are the futures of Station 3 and 4, where do we best locate them? Is it the current area? And we can look at mapping models to see how that would best work to provide the shortest response times and the best level of service. So turn it over to Chief Tyler.
Okay, so just in continuation of the current slide, basically in summary, we have made progress in toward implementing Ann Arbor's fire vision. One of them is the new one-channel dispatching protocol, and the introduction of the new CAD system, which is supposed to happen in October, will help all fire departments improve, not just the city of Ann Arbor, improve reliable measurements of turnout and travel times. It will improve communications between dispatch and the Ann Arbor Fire Department, which is what we desperately need. With the addition of FireView and the dashboard software, we will be able to gain and improve data on mapping of time of day and location of calls. Okay. We will be using target solutions to help fill capabilities to increase the crew training. We will also be replacing Firehouse, as Chief Taylor mentioned, with an up-to-date learning management system, because the one that we currently have will not do the job that we need to have done. We will rely on several software programs to obtain the data needed to support locations and staffing models. This is something that we continue to work on. So significant measurable progress needed on components of strategic plan. Of the strategic plan, the 8 strategic objectives, the first one, champion a regional public safety dispatch service. We have been working with surrounding agencies to strengthen mutual aid procedures and policies. We continue to do that as we speak. The second one, achieve and maintain national accreditation. With the hiring of Assistant Chief Kennedy, we are hoping to get some consistency and to ensure the process to give it the special attention that it needs. To invest in public engagement and development and diversity within the workforce. As Chief Taylor has mentioned, we continue to make strides in those fields, and I'm also here, and I hope to, thanks to Ellen adding me to the committee, I hope to exact some change in that as well. Elevate regional partnerships. We continue to do that, establish regional command protocols. One of them is the addition of Blue Card, which helps all the departments to be able to communicate collectively whenever we are on an emergency situation. Also, by seeking out partnerships, we are able to enjoy EMS and fire responses and joint training as well. Number 6, enhance first responder service capabilities. We are continuing to meet about EMS Emergency 1 capabilities and ALS Paramedic One responder programs. As a matter of fact, I do believe they met today, so we're continuing on that with that process. And then finally, we continue to collect data to help support a fire station master plan and ensure sufficient, sustainable resources, infrastructure needs. Thank you.
Oh, I was just going to say that's our conclusion, so if you have questions.
Thank you very much. Questions? Councilor Blum?
Had to guess. Thank you very much for your presentation. And just before I forget, so Assistant Chief Tyler, Assistant Chief Taylor, that list that you just read to us, if you could just send that along to us, 'cause it wasn't in the slides, that would be great. And Assistant Chief Taylor, if you could send along the stats. You did this orally on the type of calls, the response categories, and the history. If you could send that to us in writing, that would be great. And also the information that you gave us orally on the inspection numbers and costs. And I can, send you an email with that if you didn't get that down. So that would be helpful. Thanks. Question about the fire station strategic plan and master plan. So we adopted the strategic plan, of course, and I do appreciate that Chief Collins and his team took on the initiative to develop the strategic plan and began the work on the master plan. And I have a specific question as it relates to the second ward in Northeast Ann Arbor. When you look, the map that you showed us, slide 16, the fire station locations versus population density, does that reflect the new developments in the pipeline?
I don't believe that it does.
Okay. In terms of just more specifically, the next steps, the process and the timeline for the plan, and including plans you might have for community engagement. Last May, Chief Collins held community focus group meetings, and they were very informative. And I'd hope that, you'd plan to have a similar level of detail in terms of community outreach. Is that, so what is the plan and the timeline for that?
I think as you saw on some of the performance measures, some things are a work in progress, some are behind. I think it is actually time, as we look towards the future vision of the fire department, to start to create another opportunity for community engagement, to talk about data, talk about expectations with response time. Chief Tyler talked a little bit about the 90% percentile from NFPA, the standard. I think we need to come to a standard that is relevant, reliable, and reproducible, if that makes sense. We have to have something that we can measure crews against. We have to make sure that it's achievable, but it's not settling for a lower degree of protection. But as I think the assistant chiefs all referred to, that standard of the 90th percentile may or may not be relevant to what we need. So that's part of the discussion too, is what are the expectations? What's the output? Ellen showed a slide that showed a decrease in fire loss. Part of that outreach also involves our friends at the University of Michigan, in that when you look at the amount of EMS calls that are downtown in the downtown urban core, a lot of that's got to do with students. So maybe the answer there is to have a smaller firehouse with an EMS-equipped unit. Maybe it's to have EMS-equipped units out in the area where we know that the events are going to occur during that time of day. So that's a discussion with another stakeholder. But as we look at where firehouses are going to be located, if they're going to be renovated, we need to make sure that our residents are comfortable with the degree of protection they're going to have. And we also need to marry that up against cost of service. So those are things that do require an increased level of community participation as we move forward. So that's a long answer. The short answer is we still need to come up with a plan for implementation. That's part of the vision for the fire department.
Okay, thank you. I would just say when we have the master plan, it would be helpful to know what the next steps are, the process and the timeline, for community engagement, just.
I think we all agree with
I also
that.
think that would help, I would hope that we could have these kinds of, again, community focus group meetings to help shape the plan. On this, I mean, the last slide, and I know you've asked us all to answer that question in writing, what's your vision for the fire department? I would just say, when Assistant Chief Tyler was talking, because you just touched on this, Mr. Lazarus, our expectations, and that Ann Arbor City Council can basically, the city can establish standards for response times. And that slide that you provided us is very informative, including the breakdown of response times for fire and EMS. But, and as you indicated, we have some room for improvement there. And I would just like to know, what we're doing, not tonight necessarily, but going forward to reduce the response time, and what we can do to improve, and how much improvement we can realistically achieve without adding or relocating stations. But in terms of standards, just as Michigan likes to, lauds itself on, accepting the best and brightest, and we cite all our, best ofs for the city of Ann Arbor. I don't like to see us generally lowering the bar, and I certainly am not an expert on response time, and so I think the national standards, that's a pretty good, darn good benchmark. That's a standard established by the professionals nationally for what response time should be. So I would question, why we'd want to set a different standard, because to address what the expectation, to lower our expectations and standards.
I think your point's well taken.
Okay.
I think part of this slide, though, is, I think what the assistant chiefs mentioned was, when we talk about data, again, relevance, reliability, and repeatability, what we need to know is where the data comes from and what's the math. And if you run the same calculation over using the same data, you'll get the same answer. So I think that's part of the calculation, as well as it being accurate or being reliable. So I would share your concern about changing standards from a nationally accepted standard, but you also have to make sure it's relevant. And I think that's part of the analysis and discussion that we need to engage in, look at best practices elsewhere across the country, and see what really suits our needs. Because in the end, the most important part of this is the chart on the lower right part of the slide, that our property damage and loss of life is decreased. But I understand what you're saying.
I look at that chart, it was slide 11, obviously our response time is good relative to the industry standard, and it's 12 minutes versus 6 minutes, 20 seconds. So, and the gap seems to be in travel time, and maybe this new CAD system, maybe we're not measuring it properly. You're the experts, not me. And, but that, it would be nice to know what we can realistically achieve and, going forward. And just one more question, just back to the strategic plan. When I sat down and discussed this with Chief Collins, and he had these community focus group meetings, and there was a recognition of challenges with response times in Northeast Ann Arbor, and he did state that the growth would add to the challenge. And at the time that we met, he said this also as well, the community focus group meetings, that a new station might be considered to supplement Station 5 on North Campus, and that I guess there was also some consideration of relocating Station 4 from Huron Parkway. And you could share the latest thinking on those possibilities.
I think those are data-driven decisions, and we know that fire codes have improved the protection against fire loss. We know that the majority of our calls are EMS related. So those are data points that go into the location of facilities and the type of equipment and the response we provide. So those are parts, again, we talk about community outreach as part of that, but it's also part of, as we improve the data collection means, making sure that we accurately use that data. That's part of the accreditation process as well. So those are all things that we need to be smarter about using the resources, because when we go to back to the very front of this presentation, public safety is a big part of our general fund.
Right.
We need to make sure we use those resources most effectively. So the
When
answer.
this came up, yeah, it
Yeah.
was, they were using the data that they had for Northeast Ann Arbor and the response times and why they were looking at, why Chief Collins was looking at, relocating relocating 4 and adding a station on the northeast side, so.
I have Councilmembers Eaton, Ackerman, and Warpahowski. Perhaps we can have a call of the day on that so that we can get to our next one. We'll see. Councilmember Eaton.
Thank you. First, I want to applaud you for your efforts on accreditation and recruiting. I understand that we're behind, but I think that these are important items, and I'm not surprised that we're behind because I think they're both really quite challenging and difficult. So I applaud your efforts, and I hope to hear about more progress in the near future. I wanted to ask a question about slide 19, where it notes that we need to seek changes in Act 312 arbitration. What were the changes we're seeking?
So I added this bullet, so I'll talk about it. I think, Act 312 has some requirements in it that deal with ability to pay and looking at comparable salaries as well as a bunch of other criteria. Our goal is to make sure that we have a firefighting force that is well compensated, fairly compensated, but our hands in arbitration are tied by this ability to pay analysis, because when we compare ourselves to others, we may look good compared to other municipalities that have greater financial challenges, but it doesn't change the fact that we're still driving towards a problem that we need to address. So when you look at the requirements of Act 312 versus the challenges we face with fiscal responsibility to our ratepayers, it's time to look at the requirements that are in there so that we can have meaningful and fair negotiations rather than being held hostage to this arbitrary ability to pay criteria, among others.
Well, I'd like to point out that I believe that we have a rather pro-labor council here, and that Act 312 is provided labor relations stability for about 48 years. And I would myself hope that we wouldn't go to the state government and encourage them to tinker with that process that has worked really quite well over the history of the
I can assure you that we're not going to go advocate for any policy issue until it's properly vetted through the Policy Agenda Committee and Council as a whole. But I am pointing out that it does create a challenge for us when we are trying to address fair and reasonable compensation.
Thank you.
Councilmember Ackerman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I would also like to extend my thanks to the three of you for a quality presentation and the work to date. I'd also just kind of give you the reassurance that looking at a fire station master plan that is data-driven in terms of what types of units are needed where would be appreciated, especially because as you look at the heat maps of activity and calls for service, the area that Councilmember Grand and I represent has a very clear need of service. And so as we're deciding where and who to put where, grateful for using the data to drive that. With that, I would just want to make sure that as infill development is occurring within the city, we're mapping correlations between population densities and calls for service and making sure that that's projected out. Since these are, now 70-year-old buildings, it's quite possible that the new ones will live for another 70 years and that the population densities as they change are going to be reflected. I think that'll do. Oh, actually, sorry, one other question, just because we did spend some quality time on the standards. The column header says 90th percentile criteria, but it refers to standards as a whole. Can you clarify how those standards are calculated and what the 90th percentile refers to?
So the left column that was referred to, that's from the National Fire Protection Association, and they list these standards for EMS response times, fire response times, and the effective response force. That bottom effective response force is for a single-family structure fire. That is not for what they would, there's low, medium, and high hazard. Your high-rise, hospital, campus residence halls, those would all fall in the high-rise. That requires even more staffing and apparatus in a shorter period of time. The 90th percentile basically realizes that there's going to be things such as weather events, so it takes within the, and I want to make sure I'm not using an incorrect term, the calls that fall within that 90% are what's used to generate that time, so it throws out
The
that
outliers.
10% outlier on each side.
And quickly, the columns 1Q, 2Q, 3Q, are those referring to quarters of the year or quartiles within the bell curve?
No, those are quarters of the year, and my understanding is it is calendar year, not fiscal year.
Those are through calendar year 17. We don't have the
Got it.
fourth quarter data. Our goal, though, over time is to match our performance measures with our fiscal years, so there's a flow from, from vision to core service to performance measurement and data capture.
Got
So
it.
we'll address that in the coming fiscal year.
Okay. Thank you, that's very clarifying.
Councilmember Warpahowski.
Thank you, Mayor Taylor. The prompt that's in front of us is what is our vision for the fire department, and for me, my highest priority for the fire department is prevention of fire-related death and injury. That's far and away the best. We've got another service that helps with EMS. I think that the EMS service is the second. A distant third is the loss of property value, especially since most of that's insurance covered. So that it's sort of moving, it's still hurtful, but people are more important to me than things. On that, I'm aware of what we're doing for fire suppression. I'm aware of what we're doing through the fire inspection for commercial property prevention and making sure we've got early detection. Through our rental inspection, we have a process for inspection that'll help us make sure that fire-related building concerns are addressed. Do we have any element in our fire program that's helping to improve fire safety for owner-occupied residences? I think of, for our family, between 8 or 12 minutes isn't going to matter if it takes us half an hour to notice that there's a fire because we don't have working smoke detectors. So is there an element of your program that's addressing that single-family owner-occupied fire risk and trying to improve, reduce the danger and/or increase the detection and reporting time to protect life?
Please do.
Well, as you pointed out, we really concentrate in terms of the fire inspections at the commercial buildings because that's what our fire code actually covers. If there's a complaint residentially wise, we have a right to go in any residential to enforce fire code. But in regards to improving that fire protection at the residential level, we've tried to go for a grant for hearing aids for the deaf and et cetera in terms of implementing devices to help. It's a bed shaker type thing. We've been looking into those types of equipment that we could try to get our hands on and purchase and disperse throughout the community to help that sense. We always have sprinklers detectors. Or smoke detectors, I should say, for the residential as well. We work very closely with Red Cross and a couple other agencies that donate those devices, and we do install them. When we see an incident, like if we go on scene and we see a residence that does not have smoke detectors, we try to hook them up so that we provide that for them. So there is some efforts there. I'm not going to say we could do more effort. Again, it comes back down to, having the personnel to do it and putting it as a priority. But I do want to point that having fires go from 144 to 95, that's going to lessen life and injuries. So.
Second question briefly, as you're doing the data analysis for the station location and such, are you also considering building age, the sort of built environment and how that affects fire. A fire in some of the new construction that's going up with modern building codes is going to be potentially a lot less dangerous than a fire in our historic neighborhoods, the balloon frame construction that goes up like, so quickly. Is that factored in as you look at the data?
Yes, that's all factored in the modeling of the accreditation. So as Assistant Chief Kennedy was pointing at, there's high hazards, medium, and low. So all of that is all modeled within the whole station modeling system or master plan and coverage, standard of coverage. So,
Thank you. And then just as a word of thanks, I'm delighted with your presentation. When I came here, I was like, where's Chief Collins? But I see we've got great bench strength, so that's really encouraging. Thank you so much for your
well,
work.
thank you. And again, thank you all for having us.
Councilmember Westphal, I can deny you nothing.
Oh, thank you. I'll make this quick. When we're talking about, our vision and master plan and station locations, are the township locations relevant?
Not wanting to speak out of school here, they are. One of the things that the fire department was working on were some forms of nearest unit response. I think that's the right way to put it.
Yep.
So that would include the Ann Arbor Fire Department responding in the townships responding within the city limits, basically depending on who's closer. So,
Great. Well, to the extent that it would affect our planning, and I know we have like the combined alert system, it'd be helpful with the data to show the location of the township stations and I guess their employment and residential density as well. And I guess as accreditation might expect or what might be helpful for us in the future, when we look at the data, like when we break out the percent of fires and medical and so on, seeing that over time and also separating out some of those big chunks. I think one of those chunks had false alarms mixed in with it. So I think to the extent that we can get as fine-grained data as possible trending over time would be really helpful. And lastly, I would echo the concern about looking at, helping people in medical distress. I live near Glacier Hills, and I can't say it's every day, but it's pretty frequently that I see a big engine come down and not an ambulance. So I guess it's possible they're coming from a different direction, but just getting a better handle on why fire is dispatched to certain kinds of calls and how we can perhaps handle that more efficiently in the future with lighter equipment and different personnel might be helpful. I've toured the HVA facility, and they seem to have a really sophisticated algorithm for where their units hang out because they know where the calls are coming from, and it's time of day, time of week, time of year. It's pretty good stuff. So, clearly, as the numbers show, we're going to have to be more efficient with a lot of our thinking around these things. So all of that would be appreciated in the future.
thank you. And I want to thank the assistant chiefs for standing in while Chief Collins is out. But it is important that you get a chance to see the folks who actually make things happen. And we have 3 great assistant chiefs, so I thank them very much. Moving on, I'm going to talk a little bit as we look at the police update, then I'm going to turn it over to Chief Baird. And the reason I want to do this is I want to talk a little bit about the Hillard-Hines report, and I want to compare it. I've heard a lot of concern expressed about the Human Rights Commission, the 2015 report they did, and whether or not, it's disjointed from the Hillard-Hines. And I know there's a lot of sensitivity to this, but I do want to talk a little bit about them because I think it shows that there's some continuity. So the first thing in the Human Rights Commission, or the HRC report, was to engage the services of a police auditor consultant. And that's in fact what we did. And that process was inclusive. Several members of the HRC participated, several members of different parts of some affinity groups from the community were all engaged in developing the scope of services, receiving and evaluating the proposals, interviewing the consulting firms, and making the final selection. I know I brought that up before, but I think it bears repeating because there's always there's a concern expressed about how true we were to the desires of our community. I said the firms that were invited to participate included all the firms that are in that HRC report. The stakeholder group served as voting members. I think I've shared with you that in a very long career, I've never had non-city, non-agency staff participate as voting members. It's the first time I've done it. We did it to make sure that what came out of this was reflective of the stakeholders who participated. Hillard Hines was unanimous choice, and there were numerous opportunities to gather community input. I think I would freely admit that some of those opportunities maybe weren't as effective as they could have been in gathering community input, but there was always the desire and willingness to meet in addition to the scheduled times. And then finally, from a pure contractual standpoint, Hillard Hines' final report was compliance with the statement of work. The next item is the comparison of what was in each report. Obviously, it said create an independent all-volunteer police review board. What's in the Hillard Hines report is a co-produced policing committee, and there were 7 recommendations that came with that. So there could be a difference in view of what the scope is. That's why we're going to engage in a task force to develop the bylaws and essentially what's the charter for this for the committee, for the commission. The HRC report recommended using alternative dispute resolution within recommendation category 3 of the Hillard Hines report. It did address ADR. It also had a total of 9 recommendations. The HRC report talked about considering implementing other changes to the police department's approach, implementing the use of crisis intervention, and community policing and engagement. And you can see that there are numerous reports, numerous recommendations that are in the Hillard Hines report as well, everywhere from community engagement to their accreditation, personnel management practices, and training. So there's overlap. It follows, the Hillard Hines report follows the recommendations. I just wanted to address that fact that there is continuity of effort here. And I think as we go through what's a very passionate item for a large number of members of our community, I wanted to lay out the fact that the report does dovetail. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Chief Barrett.
Mr. Mayor and Council, thanks for having me. So first thing I'm going to talk about is an update on some items that you saw in the budget from last year, or the budget year that we're currently in right now. So I'm going to give a few updates on that, starting off just by discussing our core services in the police department. It is patrol, criminal investigation, traffic safety, parking enforcement, and community engagement. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of those. So in the patrol section, the scope of service that we talk about is, this is the kind of the bread and butter of what people see in the police department responding to emergency calls for service. The things that we identified that we were going to be tracking is citizen perception of safety is high. That's obviously in a community that's not crime-ridden. That's one of the more important things that we can look at, is how the people that live here, work here, and visit here feel about the safety. And towards that, we have on our website a survey that can be taken, and what I found when I looked at it is that we really need to reinvigorate that survey so that kind of push it again. Like most surveys that the city does, there's an initial enthusiasm over it, but use has been fairly limited since that time, so we're going to look at that. One of our goals is to have no reports of non-availability of police units for a priority call for service, and we have been able to achieve that. Staff morale is high, and collective bargaining units are negotiated in a timely manner. Some of these are going to be probably tweaked a little for next year because we found some difficulty in obtaining some of the data. However, we are going to be doing an annual employee survey, and as far as the collective bargaining agreements, we're pretty good right now. The police department actually has 7 unions that members of 7 unions fall within the police department, and I think all but 3 of those are current right Criminal investigation. So this is the Detective Bureau. This is the people that do the follow-up on the calls for service. Some of the things that we are looking at in those areas is a 100% felony criminal cases with a solvability factor will be assigned to a detective. On the bottom there, if you want to read at your leisure, it talks about what solvability factors are, but they're basically leads that people can follow up on. We also try to assign all reasonable misdemeanor cases with a solvability factor as well. In the Ann Arbor Police Department, few cases are investigated at the road patrol level. Most of them occur in the DB. The one exception to that would be something driving related. It usually remains with the officers. And then one of the other things that we really look at in the DB, especially it continues to increase, is the need for cell phones specifically, but also computers to be forensically examined. This is really, this technology is really, really expanding. We began our computer forensics unit 4 years ago now, and the work just keeps on coming. If you can imagine, anytime anybody is committing a crime, they would have a cell phone with them, and so we can use that information to tie them to locations. It's really helpful. It got to be to the point where, however, where we really didn't have the bandwidth to do all of the devices that we ideally wanted to, and so we added another body, a second FTE, to help kind of keep up with the flow. That person got promoted, so we're back down to one, so we have a little bit of a deficit there, but we're going to be looking at expanding that again in the future. Traffic safety. This is obviously, I've received emails from everybody up here regarding traffic safety in your neighborhood, so I know it is very important to everybody. So the things that we do measure along traffic safety is, everybody is aware, because I know I've told everybody about the traffic survey, is that we try and have all of our traffic complaints at least evaluated within 1 week. We're not quite there, but we're pretty close. We have school zone complaints we try to have assigned within 3 days of evaluation. There's a little bit of wiggle room that we put in there. If we have something that's, one of the advantages to using the survey tool is that if we have something where we have multiple reports about a specific incident, we can prioritize that over something that we maybe get a one-off complaint on. And then the other thing that we try and do is have over 99% of our crossing guard locations are staffed. We're actually, I think, at 100, although it's been a bit of a challenge lately. We do need to bring on 1 or 2 more part-time crossing guards for fill-in purposes due to some extended absences right now. Parking enforcement and community standards. We want all of our 100% of our complaints to be assigned. Obviously, that can ebb and flow, as we saw during some of our recent snow events. Sometimes we, this last, the big snow that we had a while back, before we could actually get to all of them, it had warmed up to 40 degrees plus, and a lot of the complaints kind of resolved themselves. So, but we are looking, we do still assign them all, but some of them it hasn't been in a timely enough manner. So. And community engagement. Obviously, this is a huge component of the Hillard-Hines report, which is what I'm going to go through a little bit more detail shortly. The goals that we came up with here when we did the budget that we're currently in, this was all prior to the Hillard-Hines process that we went through. So we may do some tweaking to these in addition going forward. But we try to have a 100% attendance rate for any community event where we are requested, and we're able to do that. Sometimes some of these events, they want the chief to be there. Sometimes they want a neighborhood officer to be there, and a lot of times the community engagement unit will pick up a lot of these as well. People seem to know how to get us there. The community engagement unit seems to be the conduit, so they will be contacted, and then they'll kind of help facilitate whoever it is that they would like to come. Citizen perception of approachability and police community trust is high. This is something that we are going to measure with the resident survey coming up. We've discussed adding a few questions in order to meet some of the specific needs that we have, looking at how we're viewed going forward. 100% of citizen complaints are investigated. That's always been the case, and we're continuing to do that. We wanted to expand our social media footprint to include Twitter, and we have done that. That has been rolled out. And Safety Town and the Citizens Police Academy are at a capacity attendance. That's another goal for us, because this is a way that we can connect with a lot of people all at once. The the Safety Town continues to be a huge success, and we get a lot of really positive feedback on it. A couple updates. I did bring one prop. I'm not going to make him come up here and talk to everybody, but Deputy Chief Forsberg has been hired. So we stole him in addition to Assistant Chief Kennedy. Both were stolen from the university. So Deputy Chief Forsberg is going to be in charge of our support services division at the police department. That is everything that is not road patrol or the DB. So it will be a lot of the administrative side of the house, and the community engagement unit actually falls under there as well. So welcome, Jason. We do have one current community standards officer vacancy that will be posted soon, and the wellness checks that council approved in this year's budget are going to be launching shortly. We believe we have a solid program that we built with our department psychologist, and we're excited to go forward with that. We are also reviewing our vehicle requirements in light of the Green Fleets policy. We may have limited ability on some of those, but we do believe we can have some impact there. So what I'm going to spend, 8:45 is the ish. Okay. So I'm going to try and get through this somewhat quickly to leave time for questions, but I'm going to go through the components of the Hillard-Hines process and just identify some things that are occurring right now. So the first part of the scope of work was civilian review and establishing the co-produced policing commission. As Mr. Lazarus has already mentioned, there's going to be a task force formed in collaboration with the Human Rights Commission in order to develop the charter. It will define the roles and responsibilities. Deputy Chief Forsberg, who you just met there, and one of our new assistant city attorneys will be the city representatives on that group. The goal is for them to complete their initial work by this summer. And at the same time, we're going to be recruiting and have begun the process of recruiting a chairperson for the group as well. We anticipate recruitment and training of the commission members to be occurring in the second half of the year. So we're going to talk about some specifics regarding everything else because the CPPC kind of has its own process ongoing, so I'm going to spend a little more time with some of these other things. So one of the things that we were asked to, or that Hillard-Hines was asked to look at is community engagement in the Ann Arbor Police Department. So Hillard-Hines recommendation number 2.1 talks about an organizational approach to community policing and kind of operationalizing it where we can do that. So some of the things that are in progress, obviously the CPPC is crucial to that because one of the items identified by the Hillard-Hines report was that the CPPC should play an active part in helping to drive what policing looks like in Ann Arbor and what community engagement looks like. So that will be an ongoing thing that we're looking at. We are looking at potentially doing a staffing study to determine staffing needs and what type of bandwidth we can free up with our staffing model in order to be a little more engaged with the community. As everybody's aware, we had a significant reduction over about a 10 to 15 year period. One of the other things we're doing as maybe as an interim or a first step is that we got a lot of positive feedback from Hillard-Hines and from the community regarding our community engagement unit. However, the criticism is that it needs to be more operationalized. So one of the things that we're doing towards that goal is having all of our new officers, when they come out of their normal training program, is we're going to have them spend some time in that unit on a rotating basis to kind of show them what the unit does and so that they can help to kind of wrap their heads around what the priorities are. Citizen complaints and discipline. Regarding the Hillard-Hines recommendation 3.1 from the report, we're looking at updating our website to include some aggregate data regarding citizen complaints against police employees. Hillard-Hines recommendation 3.4, appropriate training and supervisory guidance for the early intervention system. The early intervention system, as A.C. Kennedy discussed some of the benefits of Accreditation, this is one of the ones that came out of the accreditation process for us, is that there is a requirement to have an early intervention system. And that was something we haven't historically had, at least in a formal way. It was because of the relatively few complaints that we have in Ann Arbor against officers. It was something that was kind of informally tracked by management, but this puts a policy in place to address those issues. Some other updates that are somewhat related. In 2015, we issued an audit policy. So for those of you that aren't aware of that, this was after the awful situation that we had with one of our officers that was just completely inappropriate on some of the traffic stops. We identified a gap there, that there were some activities that the police officers were undergoing that was where there was very little supervisory contact and oversight. If somebody is arrested, they always come in and the supervisor reviews that. However, we had this gap that had occurred, and so we issued an audit policy. We worked through the officers union with it, and so once per shift change, a certain period of time is assigned randomly by our professional standards unit to the supervisor, who will go through and they'll review the video, the body cam video, the in-car video, the reports, any arrests that have been made. Had this process been in place prior, we might have been able to avoid some of those situations that we saw. We have also, as you're all well aware, have fielded body-worn cameras in the police department. This was approved by council in early 2015. And for the last 6 months, 8 months, we have been fully deployed. We have seen some challenges in regards to the FOIA, the time that's necessary to do redactions and such, and so we've made some staffing adjustments to accommodate that. But they're out there. They are absolutely love them. The first thing when we get a complaint now is that we ask, please let there be video. It really, really does help us out. Regarding CALEA, this is the most concrete part of the Hillard-Hines report that we will probably be able to put a bit of a check mark next to fairly early. So the 4.1 regards the CALEA compliance and the process. And as I updated everybody, I have some specific dates if I didn't give them the last time when we met in December. But the on-site assessment is scheduled for March 3rd through the 5th. Part of that will be a public hearing that will be that Sunday. I think it's a Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. And that's the Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And so on Sunday, March 5th, there will be a public hearing held in this room that is going to be run by the CALEA inspectors, and there will be opportunity for people to engage them at that time. Assuming that the on-site assessment goes as we expect, the CALEA award would occur in July at the Grand Rapids Conference. And as I discussed before, the initial lift for the accreditation process can be very cumbersome. So we actually had an FTE that was tasked with that. They were just the accreditation manager. The maintenance of the accreditation is a little bit less intensive, and so we're going to do a little bit of shifting as far as the responsibilities go and hopefully free somebody up to do some other things. And personnel management. So a lot of the recommendations from the Hillard-Hines report in this area comes in from the hiring. And so I'm going to talk of 5.1, 5.2, and 5.6 all speak to trying to increase our candidate pool. One of the things that's going on in law enforcement in Michigan right now is that 97% of the academy graduates are white males. And so using that as our primary pool to draw people, it's challenging to have any kind of diversity influx into the department. We're at a stage now, as you're all aware, where we have a lot of people retiring. A lot of the diversity that we had in the department at that time for years is now leaving, but the pool is not the same. So one of the things we have to do is we have to decide we're going to go to a different pool for our candidates. We're not just going to be solely focused on looking at academy graduates, people that put themselves through the academy. So we began the process of sponsoring people, identify people that we think would be a good fit, and then sending them to the academy. We did it, we had a rather accelerated process several months ago. Started with 5 candidates, only ended up being successful with 1, and she is actually now in our in-house academy. But we're looking at trying to be a little more intentional this time, so we have a posting that is just closed for people that would fall into this category. And the idea would be that they would start in May at the Washtenaw Academy. And so we're going to see how many we can get and see if we can help move this process forward. The city's Human Resources Department has been very helpful in recruiting. They've done a lot of recruiting at colleges, and we'll send people with them. So it's something that's still a work in progress, but we think we're moving in the right direction. Okay, personnel management practices. 5.3 is specifically speaks to a little more robust recruiting effort. And one of the things that I will be asking for in this upcoming budget cycle is that 1 additional FT that I discussed in December. It would be a training officer that would free up our training sergeant to be a little more proactive in the recruiting arena. Also talking about promotion practices and having community engagement be a part of an evaluation for promotion. It is right now, and it always has been, but we're looking at ways that we can expand on that as well. Another couple updates. We did hire the 1 recruit officer that we sent to the academy. She was hired and started with 4 others that were all either out of the academy or shamelessly stolen from other police agencies. They began on January 8th with scheduled retirements that we have coming up by the end of February. That will keep us flat at our authorized strength, the constant battle that we're fighting that I've talked to everybody about before. We can bring them on, but we just keep going right back down. So the group that just to give everybody an idea of why it can be such a challenge, we talked about the 30-day window that somebody has to give in order to file for retirement. But the officers we just hired that just hit the road in early January, they will not be independent officers on their own until October, November. So it's a pretty extensive time frame. When you add in potentially a 17 to 20 week state academy that we would be sending people to, it's gonna stretch it out even longer. So there's gonna be some give and take. We're gonna try and hire people the more conventional way as well to kind of keep the flow going. But in order to increase diversity, we're gonna have to change the way that we're looking at this. And training. Training is obviously a big component that Hillard Hines looked at. 6.1, 6.2, 6.4, and 6.5. All of those will be established or will be moved. We'll move the ball down the field a little bit with those, with the assigning of a new training officer to kind of, like I said, free up the bandwidth and try and move some of these initiatives forward. And that is all I had as far as a formal presentation, but I'm happy to entertain any questions.
Good evening. First, I'd like to thank you for the quick response of your department to the home invasions in the northeast area of
Certainly.
town. I really appreciate your responsiveness to that. On page 26, you talk about solvability factors.
Mm-hmm.
Do we measure clearance rates? You know, when we initiate an investigation, the rate of closing files?
We do, but what we have found, it used to be that those were some of the things that crime rates were parts of the budget that we measured. It was in our budget goals. The tricky part with that is that the FBI crime statistics are 18 to 24 months behind. So by the time they release this information, we're no longer in the budget year that we were measuring it. So although we're aware of it, we didn't find that it was a good goal to have to tie it to a specific budget year because of that lag time.
But internally, do we keep track of clearance rates?
Yes, we do.
Okay. And so do you have an idea of what our clearance rates are?
No, I'd have to research that. I can do that, though.
Do we have a fairly sizable backlog of unresolved crimes?
It depends. When you talk about clearance, some people talk about if a case is cleared versus if it's solved. And those aren't necessarily the same thing. There's some times where we would solve a crime even though we weren't able to clear it. There's times where we would exceptionally clear a call. So we don't have a significant backlog, but we do assign a lot of cases in Ann Arbor. That's not necessarily true at some other agencies. We really assign all of our felony cases. If there's somewhere they can go with it, it gets assigned to a detective. And then sometimes we just have to see where the investigation leads.
And so how do we define the clearing a file or a complaint?
I'm sorry?
How do we define a clearance?
A clearance is the way that a case is cleared is I can follow up with a little more detail. It would be hard for me to answer today because there is a definition of what a clearance is, and it's tracked through MICR, which is the state police, and so there's been a change in the model and the way they look at it as well. But I can get you more information.
Okay. So then in follow-up, if you would provide us with the definition of clearance, just an idea of internally what we believe our clearance rate is for the last couple of years, and kind of an update on how many open files we have that are not yet cleared or resolved.
Okay,
I'd
yes, I can
appreciate that.
come up with something like that.
Last year, when you were in front of us, you suggested that you couldn't take on any more FTEs in your department because there just wasn't the capacity to train them as quickly as they were retiring, I believe is a fair way to describe it.
It is.
This year, our mayor has issued a end-of-year update that he suggests we're going to take on 2 new FTEs for road patrol. What's changed that we can this year accommodate 2 extra hires, 2 extra FTEs that wasn't present last year?
I actually don't know that I can. I don't know that I can take the department from 122 to 124. However, there's one position that was removed from the road patrol in order to better be prepared to handle the FOIA implications. That was one of the positions, and the other one is the training officer. So that one is, if we can't go forward with that, that just may delay some of the actions on the from the Hillard Hines recommendations. But as far as whether or not we can actually take the department from 122 to 124 is going to be completely dependent on if we have fewer people leave than are eligible. If we have everybody leave that's eligible, I won't be able to keep up.
Again, thanks for everything your department does.
You're welcome.
Councilmember Warpahowski.
Thank you, Mayor Taylor, and thank you, Chief Baird, for the report. I especially am glad to hear the work on the early intervention system, the work on the police academy and the alternate recruitment. I was glad to see that some of these were actually in place before we received the report, and that you've been able to continue to move forward with them. And it's delighted that we've got our first candidate coming through that now. So good work there. I had a question on the early intervention system. As the community debate around police accountability has gone forward, a lot of the questions that have been very passionately argued have been, have the police violated a rule? Has an officer violated a rule and that thus should be subject to discipline and isn't being disciplined? I haven't seen anything that convinces me that that officers who have violated a policy or a law or a procedure are not being disciplined appropriately. But I think there's a more nebulous case that there is a wide range of discretion that officers have, and there might be a situation where they didn't break a rule, but there may have been a better way that they could have handled the situation. So it's not a disciplinary thing; it's a coaching thing. And I guess I'm wondering, I'd like to hear from you. One, what are the processes in place to help when that comes up, either to help that specific officer, or maybe use that as a group learning experience for for a variety of officers to say, here's what worked well or what we could have done differently. And 2, as I know it's early in the police, whatever we call it, the police committee's process, but do you see a discussion of that kind of, it's not a disciplinary conversation, but it's a what were the other alternatives here, how could we respond differently? Do you see a conversation like that coming forward with that committee?
I do. I think that's probably going to be one of the priorities for the group. I mean, if I could imagine what they're going to be looking at. As far as what we're doing now, that's already been something that's ongoing. If we see an officer who has, I'll use use of force as an example, because that seems to be one of the topics that people are most concerned with. So when we have a police officer use any force at all, it goes through a multi-stage review process. And it starts off with their sergeant, their lieutenant, the deputy chief, and they all review these, the use of force. And so in the end, the evaluation that's occurring on the paper is what we talked about, or what you've already discussed. Did they break a rule? Was what they did in line with their training? Was it in line with the law? Was it appropriate? And so we already look at that. And so, but what we will see on occasion is, maybe with some of our newer officers is, these are all justified, but it's showing something where we could send this person to some more training until they get that level of exposure to these calls, where maybe they are able to open up their trick bag and so that they can do more. So that already kind of occurs, but it's on an informal basis. So this is more formalizing that process.
And so is that the kind of thing that would be captured by your early intervention system then?
Yes, in the early intervention system, it is still in development right now, but this is one of those things where the CALIA model isn't necessarily a great match in a place like Ann Arbor, because we have so few incidents that if there is something that we see where a particular employee is using force more than their peers in similar situations, the supervisors already know about it in Ann Arbor, just because there's such a small agency and there's so few uses. But yes, it would formalize the process to identify that.
Counselor Ackerman-Lum.
Thank you, Mr. Meyer. Thank you, Chief, for being here and for the presentation. Really appreciate the content of it. I want to circle back to Councilmember Eaton's question around clearance and maybe move it to cases that have been resolved. Do we track by success, or by solvability factor, the outcomes of cases?
Those items are tracked. It's tracked internally in our detective bureau. The place where I would have to do a little more research is the cases that aren't actually assigned. There's some cases that occur that there's no follow-up that's reasonable to take on, so they never get assigned.
Yeah.
As far as the ones that actually get assigned, that is where we would talk about a clearance, or in case where they're not assigned, it might remain open, or they may close it at some point. But in regards to the specific question about the information, it's captured internally, and there's not really a good external benchmark. What we found is that over the last several years is that there's very little consistency in Michigan from how one agency tracks and calls a clearance to what another one does. And so we find that it's hard to find a good point of comparison.
Sure. I guess I was less concerned with the benchmark. You all have a track record of catching people who need to be caught fairly quickly, and I appreciate that. I guess my interest was more if there are solvability factors that have a higher yield rate, how do we communicate that out to neighborhood watch groups so they know what and when to communicate back to you with potential evidence?
I think your question doesn't fully grasp the solvability factor. So the solvability factor are the things involved in a case, not necessarily like a crime prevention tool, things they can look for. It's more along the lines of if we have a case where we have a suspect or a license plate, that would be a potential solvability factor.
Right. So it's the inputs. The output would be you resolving the case. And
Yeah.
we can leave it for now and talk
Okay.
offline.
Okay.
I don't want to waste other people's time.
That's all right.
The jump to slide 29, you referenced new questions for our citizen satisfaction survey to address specific issues of concern. I'm just wondering what those new questions may be, what you're trying to measure that we haven't been measuring before.
The citizens survey doesn't look at approachability. It looks at overall perception of safety, that
Yeah.
kind of thing. So it would be more along the lines of digging in. The survey questions, as they're written, is meant as a kind of blanket approach to compare across jurisdictions. But to have these add-on questions, they add a little bit of cost for us, but we can be a little more intentional if there's certain items that we're trying to gauge. So part of that is, one of the things that we're looking at is, today from you, is to see if there's anything that you think would be helpful.
Are we allowed to break, or do we have the ability to break that data apart by demographic, just to better understand how different groups in the community, rank on that
I'm not sure
approachability
that we
factor?
do with the current form of it, but that is something we could follow up later.
Yeah, I mean, if we're going to start measuring approachability, I think it would be very valuable to know how that differs across demographics.
And I'm not sure if that would be the tool for it, the citizen survey, because of the, like I said, it's kind of a template that's established, but it might be something we could do in another way.
Thank you. Oh, and then quickly, jumping then to 37, final question. The hiring of the training officer to free up bandwidth. I'm wondering, so now there's a training sergeant and a training officer on staff, or there
No.
will be shortly?
Right, hopefully, yes. Yeah, that's the goal. So we used to have we had a training sergeant, a training officer, and then we had other people that handled hiring. And when we were, 200 some officers, that was really easy to do. As we've gone down, people have combined roles, and we've been able to pull it off at what I would describe as kind of in a bare bones way. We've been able to continue to hire, we've been able to continue to conduct training, but the role, those two should really be at least two independent positions.
So, I guess, once we're fully staffed on training, what is the expectation of their work plan and the timeline to accomplish what I think a lot of people in the community see as the lowest hanging fruit from the Hillard-Heisen report, that being improved training outside of just tactical training?
Well, that's actually, those things are already occurring,
Okay.
and they have been. That was one of the areas where I didn't necessarily agree
Okay.
with the outcome, because those things are ongoing. Some of it was occurring during the evaluation process, but the de-escalation training, the implicit bias training, although the implicit bias is fairly new to the AAPD, but we've done de-escalation training, and the tactical training, that's another component that I really think is important for people to understand. When the officers are doing what was described as a tactical training, whether it's a hands-on thing, the de-escalation component is often built into that. It's not done in silos. There's been research that have shown that that's the least effective way for police to train in use of force, is to do it in silos. Okay, we're going to train in talking to people. We're going to train in the use of mace. We're going to train in the use of a taser. We're going to train in lethal force or the use of a firearm. It's the least effective way to do it. So when the training is being established every year, those components are already built into it. So it may be that it's firearms training, but it involves decision making. It involves those things. So it's not quite as separate and distinct. It's kind of meshed together.
Okay. Thank you.
I have Councilmembers Lum, Graham, and Westfall, and then perhaps we'll break then for questions. Pardon me, not for questions, for public comment.
Yeah, I see you have 3 minutes before the 8:45.
That is our rule. I guess I'd suggest that we run through those three council members with questions and
Okay.
then call it a day.
Do you need a motion to do that?
I'm going to
think
suspend our.
From the floor,
Or
I-
just go to public comment now and then ask our questions after?
I guess I'd prefer to finish up and then,
Okay,
since we're close.
okay, I've got a few questions, so.
Yes.
My apologies. Yeah, you're all smiling, I'm sorry. I'll do my best. Thank you very much. Pick your favorite. Pick my favorite? Okay, I have a few favorites, which is why I suggested maybe just going to the public comments first. Councilmember Grand. Sorry, I have more questions than time. I'll try to do my best. Okay, so the two key Hillard-Hines recommendations of the 65 or so were to implement a co-produced policing committee and to reinvigorate community-oriented policing in Ann Arbor. And on the second, the community policing, which is slide 32 in the presentation, the actions in progress include a staffing study and operationalizing community engagement. And when do you expect to have the staffing study completed? And can you also confirm that the staffing study is looking at community engagement and community policing, and not just the staffing and resources required to implement the co-produced policing committee?
So the staffing study, one of the things that I'm going to be looking at during the budget process is to ask for the funds to do that. We had one done by the Plant Moran Group years ago. We have kind of informally asked what it would do to reproduce a document such as that, and they're ballparking us at $150,000. So I don't have the details yet as far as what it would give us. We would be doing that through the request for proposal.
When was the Plant Moran study last done?
It was in 2000, it was in the early 2000s.
If someone could send that, obviously it's dated, but
It
we'd love
is.
to see it. Okay,
It is.
thanks. Because obviously what we've done, if that was done in 2000, you know, I think of our numbers, I mean, total FTEs, you're down almost 40% from fiscal year '01. So whatever that staffing study recommended, our trajectory was, you know.
When the staffing study came out in the past, it was, what it did is it gave us, these are a few different models you could look at, and this is the number of officers that would be needed in order to provide the service with the parameters that were established at the time. At the time, the officers were on 8-hour shifts, and so one of the things that we did once the numbers started to attrit down to a level where it wasn't manageable to keep it at that is we changed the staffing model, initially to 10-hour shifts and then ultimately to 12-hour shifts, just because we can do it with fewer people that way. So that was one of the outcomes. And now what we really need to do is have them look again and say, based on a 12-hour shift model, this is how many people, in order to provide the level of service you're providing today versus any additional asks that may come out of this other process.
And then just, can you also confirm that in terms of staffing, that we would be looking at not just the staffing and resources required, as I said, to implement the co-produced policing committee, but to also, you know, implement community policing, and that we are looking at community engagement?
We are. So the staffing
staffing.
needs for the CPPC, I don't think are significant at all from the police department standpoint. It's basically Deputy Chief Forsberg. So he will be the primary person that's involved in the group. Now, what might come out of that group is still a bit of an unknown. So the co-produced policing committee may come out and say, hey, this is the level of service, the level of community engagement that we want the Ann Arbor Police to engage in going forward. Some of those are just unknown at this point until this process runs its course. The CPPC becomes engaged, and then we can decide, they'll at some point make some kind of a recommendation regarding what they think policing should look like in Ann Arbor. And then if there's staffing changes needed as a result of that, that would be the time to evaluate that.
I mean, where I'm coming from, I'm interested in this other key recommendation to reinvigorate community policing in Ann Arbor. And you know, in your slide 29, you had community engagement performance metrics. I don't see community-oriented policing there, but you have other activities, but not COP, community-oriented policing activities. Okay, follow up on, because this came up, Councilmember Eaton brought this up, and then some others touched on this, on staffing, not specifically related to tonight's presentation, but at our council retreat in December. So I just want clarity on this. It was indicated then that 2 police officers were being added to patrol. And those added 2 officers were also listed in a response to a question I had submitted Monday, and were referenced in Mayor Taylor's recent annual report communication as additions to patrol. And anyway, my 2 questions on that, if you can clarify, I mean, tonight, earlier, you said that 1 position was removed from patrol and 1 is for a training officer, but can you clarify then if these are net adds to patrol or not? I mean, the reason I ask is that, again, the council retreat materials indicated, quote, 2 officers are being added to patrol to replace staff pulled off for training and FOIA, end quote. So that, to me, sounds like the number for patrol isn't, that are dedicated to patrol is not changing.
So there's the number kind of on paper, and there's the number in reality of what's actually out there due to the process we continue to go through with the retirements. But that number, to go from 122, our authorized strength right now in the sworn ranks is 122. That going to 124 would do two things, and it's actually kind of one of each. We are replacing somebody that has been removed from the road. In order to handle the FOIA implications, we took somebody off the road essentially and put them in an administrative role.
Right.
So that's the first one. The second one has yet to occur, because the second one is something I'm still going to be coming to council with. That is the addition of a training officer. And if that occurs, if that is approved, then it would be essentially a net zero change in
So we're
patrol
not adding
level
to patrol,
staffing.
right.
However, if that is not approved, then I'm just going to have to make a decision whether or not I want to do it anyway. In light of some of the things that we have to get done, I'll just have to make that
Okay, so
determination.
what I'm hearing is we're not adding to patrol. And the FTE budget for police did not include any increase for fiscal year 18. So if we're hiring additional FTEs, shouldn't we be, I guess this is for the city administrators, amending the FTE budget as we did Monday for the sustainability folks?
As Councilmember Lummy pointed out at the last council meeting, the changing of the part-time to full-time FTE for sustainability was an off-budget cycle move. The addition of the two officers is with the 2019 budget, so you'll get to review that within the context of the budget approval.
Okay. Okay, another metric question, and I appreciate that both police and fire that you've included your performance metrics for your key services. That's very helpful. On slide 27, you touched on what in progress means. I think you said you're not quite there yet, but we're pretty close, and you're consolidating requests.
In consolidating requests?
Yeah, I guess you said when these traffic complaints come in, you assess
Okay.
the locations.
So the process,
and the
I could
type
talk
of
through the
complaint.
process. When a traffic complaint comes in, we have a single point in the department that views them all.
Right.
Officer Atkins, who many
Yep.
of you have met.
I know
And
she's
so
one
she-
person who takes, yeah.
She's the one that takes them all in.
Right.
And she's the one that will then compare them to the others that we've received to determine priority level. So if we have speeding on Pontiac Trail, for example, if we get 5 or 6 of those all at once, we know we need to probably prioritize that call or that complaint. What I'm saying is that we are not at the level yet where she is able to evaluate all of those within a 1-week period. And we are not quite at the level where we are able to assign every school-related complaint within 3 days of evaluation. And I don't have any specific numbers, but I can tell you that we're not quite there.
Okay. And then on that, too, included in the scope of services is to enforce traffic regulations. Again, I'm looking at slide 27. Given that, that's in the scope of services, shouldn't there be some measure, some metric for, other than just evaluating complaints? I mean, we have no metric for enforcing that, traffic regulations. It's listed on the top in the scope
Yeah.
of services, but no
So-
metric.
One of the things that we've tried to do in the police department is look at outcome measures as opposed to output measures. And so that's why we're looking at, going forward, we're going to look at additional things such as the citizens' perception of traffic safety. Because as I've stated to a few of you in the past, if the desire is for citations to be written, the officers could do that all day long. They know where to go to write tickets. But our goal with traffic enforcement is always on improving safety. And so writing tickets where they can write tickets at the expense of maybe being in some of these neighborhoods where a violation could potentially have more significant impact is something we're kind of constantly battling.
I will just say, I just think, because it's identified as a deliverable, having some kind of metric, I think, would be helpful, particularly since we pass various regulations on, the safe passing distance for pedestrians and bicyclists, and, on
Like
and
an
on.
output measure? Like
Just,
number of
yeah,
citations?
some kind of, I mean, it's a deliverable, so having some kind of, status, just knowing that we're tracking these things, and so we're not just passing regulations that, who knows what's being enforced and how we're monitoring it. It's kind of an unknown, so without any metric associated with it. And then lastly, one thing we discussed at the retreat was succession planning and trying to balance the retirements and the replacements, and I know you're looking at a lot of retirements. Can you update us on where that effort stands?
No significant updates in the last couple months, but I think today I have 18 people that could retire if they wanted to. So I don't anticipate all of them going, but we're still at the case where roughly half of the sworn staff is eligible to retire in the next 5 years. And as far as the onboarding, our capacity is 6. If we get a class with, it's a constant balancing act. If we get a class that is heavy in prior experience, people that we've stolen from other agencies, we can potentially increase the number of people in the program because they spend less time in training. However, that's going to be at the expense of some of the things we talked about with regards to diversity, so.
I just, the comment, my 2 cents on that. I mean, I appreciate that we're looking at, I think we need to, given the number of retirements and that we're, that will pose, obviously in succession planning, this is an area where we really need to drill down. And so looking at alternatives to our present onboarding process, I think is important to find ways to increase our hiring capacity beyond the, 12 a year would be a good thing for us.
Councilmember Grant.
Thank you. Thank you for being here, and being so patient with us. I had a question about number 3.1 on slide 33. When we talk about, what our vision is, and if we were to survey citizens, what do we think some of the core issues are? Trust is one that I think is just absolutely critical. I don't know how you're going to phrase that question exactly, but I think what what we're hearing loud and clear is that we want to make sure that the communities that are disproportionately impacted by crime, and we know that it is disproportionate, that there's some equity, that there's trust with our police department. So I am interested. It was a might here instead of a will, and sort of where are we on that might versus planning to do, considering reviewing how we can get some more data out there to the public. And the action was about the website, but other steps, and I think Councilmember Ackerman alluded to it earlier, where we can push some of that information out to neighborhoods, particularly those that are more impacted, to give them updates.
Regarding complaint data
Yes.
against officers?
Not necessarily against officers, but just even in general. But yes, I understand the disciplinary data is one issue, and then there's other data that we can get out there as well.
Yes, crime-related stuff, we absolutely can, and we do through the Neighborhood Watch program. But as far as the actual, maybe I'm not totally following your question. It's the, what I was discussing in this case is that we are going to try, right now, if somebody makes a complaint against the police department, following the investigation, we then communicate directly with the people that made the complaint. And we don't go beyond that in most cases, with some exceptions of, obviously, the BTC incident was one where the reach out was a little more broad following the investigation. But in general, we only limit it to the people that made the complaint. And so what we're looking at is taking that information in a aggregate manner, at least, and producing it for the public.
Yeah, I do think that does make a lot of sense, because you don't have to have identifying information to be able to release that information. And it might, I think it can show both positives and negatives, right? That the aggregate is maybe not as severe as some people might think it is, but it also, increases transparency. So that's, and also if we can get, I think you were speaking to it earlier, but a question on the citizen survey related to police and pedestrian safety, that would be excellent.
Councilmember Westfall.
Thank you. I have a couple of different questions. Some are small and one is general. Just following up on Councilmember Lum's question about, okay, this has to do with traffic complaints, and I don't want this to infer that we haven't struck a balance between, where, in your judgment, the safety violations are occurring, or in the citizen's judgment where you need to be. That's a whole different question, but to the point of the difference between evaluated, assigned, and then what about completion? So I guess it would be, I think the most important to me would be completion, assuming it is, you've exercised some screening judgment in whether it's worth being there and how urgent the priority is. So I guess that's, getting some of these definitions, the notion of clearance came up before. If we're going to be tracking these over time and sort of weighing, well, violent crime is going down, but our clearance rate is going down, so, as an example, that would indicate to you all where resources would need to be assigned. So I just, that having those definitions and metrics is important to me. And I'm glad that you've asked us what kind of metrics are important that we might put in the consumer survey. I would say, I would still want more suggestions from you all about what kinds of metrics you think we should be holding you accountable for, because just like fire service is changing, I imagine policing is changing in ways that we don't even understand, and how you can be most effective at intervening to help the health, safety, and welfare of the community. It's not in the traditional ways anymore, and we keep seeing these budget gaps growing, and I don't know if we'll have the luxury of adding FTEs, or if they're going to have to be reassigned, and how do we evaluate how they get reassigned, unless there's appetite for a millage. So those are broadly things that are concerning to me. One small question having to do with video. I'm really glad that those are deployed and it's of use. I realize there's a delay in looking through them and redactions and so on. Have you had any difficulties in retrieving legible video or audio when there's been a request for it? Meaning, the camera was clipped to a jacket and it was thrown in the back and we don't have the video, for example. Or how is that working out? Are there hiccups, or is it going pretty well?
I would say it's going pretty well. There certainly are incidents where that will occur. A lot of times what we have found too is if there's a physical scuffle at all, sometimes the camera will get knocked off, things like that. So there are times. We've also had some equipment failures, but all in all, we've been able to capture the things that we've been trying to capture.
Great. All right, thank you.
Councilor Bannister?
I noticed that part that morale was high in the department, so I'm sure that's at least in part due to your leadership, so.
Thank you very much.
Congratulations on that. And I noticed some of the psychology issues. You were saying that when you're looking for hiring, you're looking for key interpersonal skills of verbal engagement and honesty, and then once the officer's on staff, they get this officer wellness check. Could you elaborate is there any more detail on how the attitude is of the officers and the health of the officers is monitored or over time?
So a lot of times what we have historically done is if there's been a problem, that's kind of what's kind of brought things to our attention, and we've been reactive to it. The purpose of the wellness checks is to be preventative. To just like a physical that somebody might have, is to have them get a checkup so that they can potentially see problems coming on and recognize that the law enforcement profession is obviously very stressful. It affects people in their private lives as well, and it can take a negative toll, particularly the chronic exposure to some of the situations they're exposed to. And so this is a way to help them build some tools to make sure that they're taking care of themselves And through the help of the psychologist, she can also, just like a wellness checkup you might get physically, they might say, hey, this is an area you could improve upon, here's some suggestions, that kind of thing.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to offer one thing for council to chew on before I say some parting thank yous. We are striving to look at performance measures that produce the outcomes we're looking for. So if you look at how many tickets are written, you will write a lot of tickets, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have a safer community. If you focus internally on reducing the number of accidents reported, you will wind up with suppression of people reporting on dangerous conditions. But if you focus on training your staff, then you can get to the outcomes that you want. So I just would be careful of really things that measure activity or outputs that may not get you to where we want to be, regardless of what part of the city government we're talking about. So if you chew on that a little bit while we go through this process of visioning outcomes and what kinds of things are important to measure, we've tried to look at those things that are leading indicators more than lagging. So when Chief talks about a wellness program, he's talking about officers that are better equipped to do their jobs, and we wind up with fewer incidents at the other end. So I think those are things that are leading edge and enlightened. Before I turn it back over to the mayor, I want to thank all of our chiefs, assistant chiefs, deputy chiefs for being here. If nothing else, I hope we all leave here with the well-founded sense that our public safety entities are in very capable hands, the hands that are forward-looking, that are progressive, and one that want us to be both agile and accountable. So I thank them for being here. I thank you for the spirited discussion, and I look forward to the responses for your questions, as well as our next opportunity in February.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lazarus. I'd like to echo thanks to all presenters today, both from police and fire. It was I think it demonstrated that we have careful, earnest, and thoughtful departments here working hard to make everyone in Ann Arbor, whether you're a visitor or a resident, safe as we can all be. So, so thank you very much for coming in and for the work you all do every day, and all your colleagues. We now come to public comment general time. Public comment general time is an opportunity for members of the public to speak to council and the community about matters of municipal interest. To speak at public comment general time, one need not have signed up in advance. Speakers have 3 minutes in which to speak, so please pay close attention to the time clock. As a matter of courtesy, we may have only one person speaking at a time. And finally, if you require assistance in speaking before council, we'd be delighted to provide it to you. Is there anyone who'd like to speak at public comment? One need not raise their hand, just queue on up and take it away.
Good evening. I speak tonight for Transforming Justice Washtenaw, representing a growing body of community members, and we call on the City Council to work to create an effective civilian police review board with these thoughts in mind. 1, we applaud the formation of a task force for which nominations are due to the Human Rights Council by January 28th. Mr. Lazarus says the deputy chief and assistant city attorney will sit on this task force despite the fact that many of your constituents explicitly expressed that this not be the case. We are comfortable having them as advisors for a task force that is community-centered. I heard Chief Byrd say that the chairperson will be selected. We want that decision to be made by the HRC. 2, our expectation is that the task force include a diversity of people representing the issues of those targeted by police and accessible to those with varying work schedules and childcare needs. 3, we are here also to represent our demand for the board that is stronger than what Hillard Hines presented in their report. The board needs to be independent, transparent, representative, and adequately funded. 4, we strongly oppose and advise against the use of the term, quote, co-produce policing as suggested by Hillard Hines. It's a weak oversight model. We expect a board that is focused on community voice, agency, and power, since, after all, that is why police exist. Using Hillard Hines' title shows an acceptance of a proposal that is not what the community has asked for. The Hillard Hines report is not equipped to take us where we need to be regarding oversight and review. In summary, we need council and Mr. Lazarus to design a task force and a board that centers accountability to your constituents, this community, and to adopt a name and a function that reflects this. This is how you meet your promise of, quote, fair, effective, and just policing, and ensure that it is, quote, the practice of Ann Arbor City Police Department and the City of Ann Arbor to recognize that all people present in the City of Ann Arbor are members of the Ann Arbor community and will be treated respectfully and fairly. We, Transforming Justice Washtenaw, will keep showing up to speak on this issue, keep informing the community, and keep working to make sure that the results are equitable, transparent, and effective. Thank you.
Thank you.
Evening all. Thank you for offering community members the opportunity to respond. My name is Sergeant Donovan Smith. I am a resident of Ann Arbor and a graduate student. When Kenneth Boucher and Deb Kirby came to Ann Arbor on November 16th to present their findings as part of Ann Arbor Police Department Independent Analysis of Community Engagement Practices, I spoke alongside Transforming Justice Washtenaw and members of the community to condemn the entire report in the strongest terms possible. It needed to be on the public record that the report was a piece of junk and a complete waste of $230,000. I won't recapitulate my full comments here, but simply stated the HH report is pro-police public relations masquerading as some kind of research. Up to today, community members have yet to receive a substantive response to the critiques that were offered that night. The PowerPoint presented tonight is yet another example of how Howard Lazarus and others seem to think they can just move on from that moment without offering a real response to the community. We're still waiting. When I spoke in front of the Human Rights Commission and City Administrator Howard Lazarus on January 10th, I took the opportunity to share results of some poking around on the internet I did about Hilliard Heinz. I wonder if Howard has been kind enough to share with any of you these discoveries before tonight's meeting. I don't see mention of these findings in the PowerPoint that he and the police chief wrote together. As I indicated on January 10th, Hilliard Heinz is a firm filled with former cops, some of whom have been implicated as defendants in massive cover-ups of police misconduct. The firm's co-founder, Terry Hilliard, was named as a defendant in 5 federal lawsuits involving police torture in Chicago. He is no longer found anywhere on their marketing materials or their website. I would be happy to share the rest of my findings with you tonight after tonight's meeting. The information should have disqualified HH from providing any sort of independent community review of Ann Arbor's police force, and it should give Ann Arbor city government serious pause before implementing anything Hilliard Heinz recommends to you. You might still be wondering why it's necessary to so fully renounce the HH report and return to the work of the Human Rights Commission, Council, and the community groups like Transforming Justice Washtenaw. Why does it matter so much? Hilliard Heinz has spent the last few years consulting all over the county. They consulted in Boulder, Colorado. They consulted in Maplewood Township, New Jersey, after an incident of racial profiling in which black teenagers were walked across the town to another town by the police. They were hired by Cedar Park, Texas, and Denver, Colorado. They were hired to investigate a sheriff's department due to a string of excessive force complaints. In New Orleans, they were in the running to manage the federal consent decree to review the New Orleans Police Department. See if you can wrap your heads around that. Former cops from Chicago were in the running to monitor the corruption of another major police department. It should concern all of us that Hilliard Heinz is all over the country, consulting in communities where racist police practices are angering local residents. Hilliard Heinz shouldn't be in Boulder, Colorado, or Maplewood, New Jersey, or Denver, or Cedar Park, or Ann Arbor. This isn't an acceptable way for police departments. For police departments and city governments to appear to address the problem right here of racist policing.
Hilliard, how do you pronounce his last name? Hilliard Heinz is part of an organized campaign to whitewash and sanitize police misconduct, cloaked in terms like independent review and security assessment. Worst of all, if their recommendations are implemented, this will strip Ann Arbor residents of the power to hold police accountable. When O.R. Rosser was killed in 2014, family members, community members, and local activists asked for an independent review of the Ann Arbor Police. No one asked for a for-profit pro-police consulting firm to take our money and tell us we needed more of the same. More police and police control over oversight. Hell no. In 2015, the HRC recommended a fully independent community police review board. Due to pressure from the police chief in 2016, the recommendation then became the RFP that led to hiring Howard Heinz. He was hired. He has been exposed. It isn't that complicated. Let's return to the HRC's original call for independent police oversight and throw out Hilliard Heinz report in its entirety. At all the meetings I've attended, the community has been standing together for a few simple things: to do justice to Ora Rosser's name, to hold police accountable to the community, to let the community control the process. And yet, Administrator Lazarus just keeps on with his memos and PowerPoints. This one he wrote with the police chief. Okay, Howard, we see you. Maybe you don't see us yet, but we see you. You aren't doing your job, you aren't listening to the community, and you still need to apologize for spending $230,000 on that garbage report. Instead, let's stand up for Ora Rosser. Let's support the HRC and their tireless work. Let's listen to the residents most affected by racist policing. Let's get behind Transformative Justice Washtenaw platform. And if it isn't already clear, that means, 1, no additional police. And don't think those additional FTEs being requested slipped past us. And 2, no police involved in community police oversight. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Shirley Beckley, and I'm a longtime resident here in Ann Arbor. I have a question for our Police Chief Baird. I am aware that the ACLU attorney staff has written you a letter regarding the mishandling or the over-mishandling of Caim. Have you responded to that letter? The other thing I would like to, since you said you were going to respond in addressing the council tonight, and the other thing I'm wondering is, have you given any further training to Officer Reed? Those are the questions I have tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Paula Uche. I live at 482 Village Oaks Court. And respectfully, I'm wearing red blood color for the color of our human blood and the color of deer blood. Human blood is precious, deer blood is precious. Human life is precious, deer life is precious. Many Ann Arbor citizens fear guns near our homes, schools, and in our parks. The killing of deer has brought much fear to our city. I can testify to this from people who have had personal relationships with the guns and hearing them. A woman was jogging around 6:30 p.m. on Hubbard Road when she heard a gunshot explode in her ear. She immediately fell to the sidewalk, covered her head, fearing for her life. She thought a gunman was on the loose, and if he was already firing at people, she was worried he was going to kill her. Okay, so she's there, going like this on the ground. And it was pure terror for her, fearing for her life. It turns out that there was a sharpshooter in a tree 3 or 4 trees away from her as she was jogging on the sidewalk on Hubbard Road, where there are a lot of students. I lived in family housing there. My kids ran the neighborhood, night, day, whatever, especially at dusk. And they saw a lot of deer there. And I can understand how bad this is because I walked my baby carriages right up that road. I jogged, I walked, I took walks with friends, lots of kids walked there. 4 trees away from a sidewalk, this happened. That's too close for comfort. Bullets can ricochet, bullets, mistakes are made. Too close for comfort. And I think that that story alone, along with other ones that I've written you over the years and that I have told you about, especially the sledders up in Cedar Bend 2 years ago. They were sledding right into a woods where the people who were sharpshooting were screaming in 4-letter words and saying, "Get out of here." They were trees away. This is too many incidents. Now, I feel that we just need to stop this and not have guns in our cities. Kids are traveling along school routes to and from at hours that are too close for comfort with the sharpshooters. Kids play. Kids don't know, and I don't care what you say about schools. I was a school administrator and a school principal. No matter what you say to kids, they're going to do what they want. Now, my concern as a monitor guarding entrances, I can assure you that people are still walking, jogging, bicycling, transporting themselves through our city parks, and they don't care. We've been monitoring for 3 years, and it's still happening. Please, no
Thank
more
you.
guns in our town.
Thank you.
Jeff Hayner, Ward 1, and I'm on the record as to how I feel about the call, and once again, my jacket outs me, but for no good reason. So I'm just going to make some comments because I try to be informed about what's going on in our city, and so here I am with a big part of our city's budget and a big part of the thing that makes our community what it is, which is a pretty safe place to live. And when I hear the professionals come up here and tell me things, I make note, especially if it's things that I'm very interested in, like the idea that new development is changing the dynamic of coverage in our town, and that high-rises represent higher risk, and they have calls for specialized gear and more staff and things like that. So I think that challenges the idea that this effort to continually grow the population of our city is paying for itself, because clearly it's not. And when we talk about the aggregated response times being double national standards, that's a concern, but I think it is reasonable to look at the outcomes versus those standards, and it seems like we're doing pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. I know some of my commercial customers are not so thrilled about the cost of service capture and the increase in inspection fees, but I'm also proud to say that the two biggest buildings I do work on, one of them, I was told that they had the first 100% clear fire inspection this year or last year. And so that was good because they run a tight ship over there. Regarding the concerns over residential property, I hate to go down the road of giving the fire inspectors free rein to go into everybody's residence and see that they're safe no matter what the safety outcome might be. But I will remind people who are concerned about that the massive gentrification that we're undergoing is being handled by the building code, and when you do remodeling over a certain size, that all the fire systems, smoke detectors, smoke alarms have to be hardwired in, and the building department's taking care of a lot of that, I imagine. Now, moving over to the police end, I appreciate their Twitter. It's informative. It helps me be informed, and it helps me share things with others, and that's pretty cool. You know, it's nice that they're getting on board with that. And I also appreciate the community engagement work. And I had the the pleasure and the pain of reading a FOIA document that was hundreds and hundreds of pages about a certain house over by Pioneer High School that is a nuisance house. And it really was an eye-opener for me because I knew names in that story. And I thought, by golly, that guy was a graffiti scofflaw for years, and I kept trying to get the police department to crack down on this guy, and they couldn't get a hold of him. They couldn't, whatever the problem was, these cases were closed, and then he sold heroin to a guy, and the guy OD'd in the house. And so these little crimes have a way of escalating to be big crimes. And so definitely community engagement is needed. We've been calling for years for beat cops downtown. What would public policing look like to me? It'd be more folks on the streets, more presence, and more police, and more greeting, and a better community. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Ed Vilmetti. I'd like to speak to the maps and graphs and charts that the fire department showed us regarding the response times and location of calls for service. I'd echo one of the questions that a member of council made to if we're going to be evaluating the quality of our fire service by response times, that we should also be looking at the complete picture, which would include other jurisdictions responding in time to those sorts of calls. I know that some parts of Ann Arbor are better served by surrounding townships than they are by the city itself, just because of geography of things. But one thing did concern me, and I would hope that someone on council would ask for this if the data is available. The department showed a map of where the service calls were, but there was no corresponding map pinpointing how long the service call times were by geography. Naively, you'd expect that calls closer to a fire station would be answered more quickly. But the discussion surrounded downtown responses where if calls get stacked up, there may be slower response times. And I'm also, I guess, a little bit concerned about data-driven decision-making if the data is questionable at the start. There's an old saying, garbage in, garbage out. If the current dispatch systems are not giving accurate times down to the second, then you can't count on the aggregates being equally accurate. And I suppose that the hope is that the new dispatch system coming out of the county this fall might allow the next round of decisions to be better decisions because the data would be better. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Vivian Chang. I'm a member of the HRC, but that's only incidental. I speak in my role as a general member of the public tonight. I'd like to refer to page 31 of the PowerPoint presentation. And on that page, I believe that the PowerPoint indicated that the deputy police chief and also a city attorney would serve as city reps for the task force that would help form the charter and also be responsible for helping shape where the oversight panel is going. I also heard the police chief state that recruitment has already begun for a commission chair for the eventual oversight panel. This seems to me to be counter to some of the conversation that took place at the most recent Human Rights Commission meeting on January 10th, where it seemed that the public insisted that they be involved in the creation of the task force and that the city be asked to, the city representatives be asked to consult but not take an active role in it. And I think that to the extent that we want to take the Hillard-Hines report at face value, the Hillard-Hines report does say that the Ann Arbor Police Department's biggest problem is that there is a lack of trust and a lack of transparency. If those are the problems that we believe are the largest that are confronting the police department, I think that it does present an optics issue to have the city head the task force who's in charge of staking out the oversight panel for the police to be both the deputy police chief and also city attorney, who I believe incidentally was a career prosecutor in her former life. I think that while both of those individuals, I do not know either of them, I'm sure they're fine people that could contribute remarkably to the creation of the charter, but it doesn't particularly look good, I believe, especially if trust and transparency are the biggest problems. Adding to that, we did want, the Human Rights Commission, it seemed, wanted to invite members of the public to put their names in for a volunteer task force. And to that end, they wanted to solicit names and wanted those nominations to close on January 28th. And I find it a little troubling that the city social media and the city website, none of those were updated with any of these requests, any of the call for nominations until today. And today is, you know, the 22nd, the meeting happened on the 10th, and this decision to ask for calls happened quite a while ago. And we weren't able to update this, make any of this information available, or really make sure that people who are interested were able to apply. And as such, we've had to push back the date again. And I think all these do contribute to lack of trust and transparency.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to speak at public comment?
I'm Pam Dent, also a member of the Human Rights Commission, but I speak as a concerned citizen this evening. I too was present at the January 10th meeting when a number of individuals from the community joined us in our regular session to express their dissatisfaction with the results of the Hillard-Hines report. And one of the things that I publicly spoke about there was directly related to the comments that were presented to us as commissioners. I want to reiterate some of what I shared in that meeting, and that is, as a former civil rights investigator for both the cities of Ohio and Nebraska, being trained as an investigator in civil rights, also presenting with over 20 years of human resources experience, and continuing that with a nonprofit business that I established with the state of Michigan, I want to share with you my extreme dissatisfaction in the fact that the slide that was presented appears to completely ignore the concerns that were expressed by the citizens, in that it was, in essence, told to us that the deputy police chief and the assistant city attorney would be a part of the task force that ultimately will establish the oversight committee. We, as commissioners, as a citizen, I have expressed extreme dissatisfaction in the term co-police producing committee. I believe it does not accurately reflect what the citizenry, self-included, has expressed interest in wanting to see our city establish. I am especially concerned that ideas that were expressed to us as commissioners would appear to have been ignored. But more so than that, I am a long-term resident of the city of Ann Arbor. I was born and raised here, went to school here. Yes, I did move away, but more so than any of you who are on this council, I have been here longer than any of you. I think I know my city, and I've seen what has occurred over the years. When things do not appear to be taken under consideration by the citizenry, then we as citizens have a right to voice our concerns and then act to make the changes that we believe are necessary. I'm more than happy to work with our city council, with our citizenry, but I think that we have a challenge when we deliberately, intentionally, and willfully ignore the comments that have been expressed, to the extent that it appears to be shoved down our throats. I would ask that we listen and then be governed by the comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, Mr. Lazarus and council. My name is Lori Saginaw. I am a member of Transforming Justice Washtenaw, but I'd like to just speak for myself. These are unwritten comments, and I very much wanted to be here at 7 o'clock when you began, but I could not come until a little after 8. I brought Shirley Beckley with me because she does not have her own transportation. She chose to forego going to a nephew's home whose son was killed in a car accident, tragically, on Wednesday. The police came to his door at 3 in the morning to let him know that his son had died. She opted to come here in lieu of that visit because of the importance of the work that we would like to do with you. I couldn't see the PowerPoint, but I did read it, and I wanted to comment very briefly on the last 2 slides. The second to the last one asked of our vision of a police force, and I did catch Chief Baird's comment about the wellness checkup, and it really encouraged me to imagine that we as a city with our police force could really help our police to deal with the stress of their jobs. And I would love to see consideration of some of that mental health funding going toward supporting them in learning to do mental health de-escalation and conflict resolution on the job. I think those would be fantastic tools for them to have in their belt, along with the gun and the taser. The other would be a comment on the last slide, which is what my hopes would be for future working sessions. And I think the basic one would be a little more advance notice so that we could be more prepared to be truly helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Phil Carroll, member of Fawn, Friends of Ann Arbor Wildlife and Nature. Our group has been speaking out against the deer cull for the last 2.5 years, and you've heard us many times. Speaking isn't enough. This year we've gotten more active. You probably have heard. We have had small groups going out to sites that we can identify. First, we monitor as many parks as we can each night. If we think there's going to be a shooting, we are able to collect a small group to go out to those sites. And we obey all the protocol. We do not go in the parks. We stay on the sidewalks. We chant very quietly. I wish we could be louder like many of the rallies that you have all seen and heard. But, you know, we say stop the shoot and save the deer and no more killing and things like that. The police and security people have been very polite and helpful, in fact, in a couple of occasions. But we want you to know, and especially we want the community to know, that we're going to continue to oppose this vicious slaughter of deers. The slaughter out at Leslie Park the other day was just terrible. Oh my gosh, it has got to stop. Okay? And we agree with the mayor. There's no need for this. It's not necessary. Thanks.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who'd like to speak at public comment? Seeing no one, public comment is closed. May I have a motion to adjourn, please? Moved by Councilor Crable, second by Councilor Smith. Discussion. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? We are adjourned.